The headline is America now on the verge of refighting the American Revolution. Now, you know, headlines have to be short, so I really probably should have said refighting both the Civil War and the American Revolution. And the point that I'm trying to make is that, and you know, it's kind of a cute device to say that the red hats we have today are like the red coats of the 1770s. But there actually are a lot of parallels. The redcoats, the British loyalists and the British soldiers believed that democracy was not a system that worked. I mean, let's just be very, very clear about that. That's the most important point that you have to understand. This was about half of the people that we now call Americans, that were called colonists in the 1770s and the early 1780s. About half of America did not want to go to war with England or with Great Britain. They were loyal to the king. And the reason they didn't want to go to war, I mean, you know, obviously some of them didn't want to go to war because they had, you know, good cushy jobs that were subsidized by the British government. There's a lot of that going on. But the theoretical underpinning was democracy doesn't work. You know, these guys, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Thomas Paine and you know, these guys are calling for democracy. Democracy failed in Greece 3,000 years ago. The Greek experiment in democracy only lasted a couple hundred years. They're talking about a republican form of government. You know, one of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson's favorite phrases, well, it was a favorite phrase of all the founders, all the way up, you know, north or south, slaveholding or not. They referred to what we have now as a small r, republican form of government. It's why when Jefferson created the second political party, the first was the Federalists that John Adams and George Washington put together, and then Jefferson created the Democratic Republican Party, which survives to this day. They dropped the word Republican in the 1820s. But they believed that a Republican form of government was possible, and the naysayers said, no, Rome, you know, was a republic. Greece was a democracy. The Greek democracy only lasted a couple hundred years. It failed. They tried it, you know, they tried it in a couple of islands even, and it failed. Sparta. And then you've got the Republican experiment of you know, the Roman Republic, and that failed. That, you know, by the year 200 that was gone. So we've had 2,000 years of living with kings and kingdoms in Europe, and it has worked. It has guaranteed stability. Yes, we have occasional wars, but hey, it works. So let's not try this experiment in democracy. They were absolutely opposed to these two principal core founding ideas that you find in the Declaration of Independence. Number one, that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. In other words, all people should have access to human rights. And number two, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Today's Republicans have a big problem with both, particularly that consent of the governed part. Over 300 laws now to make it harder to offer your consent, in other words, to vote. And obviously, that whole part about human beings having unalienable rights, I mean, you know, they're obviously opposed to that. In the Revolutionary War, the people who believed in democracy were fighting a war against both a physical and a psychological war, and kind of a spiritual war. You know, this is a belief system against people who believed that kingdoms were necessary. That if you had a democracy, the people would simply vote everything to themselves, they'd drain the public purse, they'd ruin the country. Average person doesn't know how to run a country, how can they vote for representation? You know, this was their argument. This, by the way, is still the Republican argument. It is an elitist, oligarchic, You know, we know better than you. Let the billionaire class rule everything. You know, it's so anyhow. During the Revolutionary War, it was let's keep the king. During the Civil War, it was essentially the same thing, except in the South, instead of kings arising, what we had were oligarchs. Because of the invention of the cotton gin and its widespread distribution in the 1820s, only to the biggest and wealthiest plantations. It was a very expensive contraption. Those giant plantations were able to undercut the price of cotton and wipe out the small competitors. So by the 1860s, this started in the 1820s, this took 2.5 generations. By the 1860s, all the really high quality productive land in the South was owned by just a few thousand families. The Civil War was a Southern oligarchic police state. It was no longer a democracy versus the North, which was more or less still a functioning democracy. And the goal was to end democracy. That was the explicit goal of the people in the South. And maintain slavery, which was, you know, part of their ending democracy. So what I'm saying now is that when we see Mitt Romney getting booed, when we see Liz Cheney about to get kicked out of the GOP, what we are really seeing is that the Republican Party now represents one thing: oligarchy, rule by the rich. They are ignoring this whole idea of the consent of the governed. They want the suppression of dissent. They're passing laws against protesting. They're making it legal to kill protesters. They're replacing the ballot box with the police state.